What does it mean to write history? You might be picturing a record keeper taking protocol at a meeting between important political figures, or a scholar writing all those records into a book to collect all that information for the future. It sounds straightforward, but it really isn't. Who is the record keeper? Is it the personal assistant of one of the politicians, meaning they might be unconsciously biased against the other person? What if the scholar collecting information for their book doesn't speak the language the record was written in, and so misses out on a critical puzzle piece? What if they're writing it down years after the events took place? These things complicate the way history is written, and it's the job of historians today to try and find the blind spots that could give us new perspectives on stories that we thought complete. Today I'm joined by Ovidiu, Olar and Konrad Petrovszky, researchers at the Institute for Habsburg and Balkan Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences.
I'm also the principal investigator of a European research grant, a starting grant called Orthodoxies in Politics. At the same time, I'm a researcher at the Nicolae Iorga Institute of History of the Romanian Academy in Bucharest.
My research is on the early modern history of Southeastern Europe. Largely overlaps with in this period with the Ottoman Empire, and my research focuses primarily on the intellectual history, cultural history, also religious history of this period. And in this context, we developed a common interest on the study of historiography, of historiographies, plural, of this period.
Unfortunately, Professor Petrovszky's microphone stopped recording at one point, so his audio might be spotty in some places. Apologies for that. But let's carry on. Historiography is the academic term for the history of history, so investigating the ways that history is written and constructed. Think about the history of your country. How was that written? Like I said at the beginning, there could be gaps in how the story came to be. In their new book, Ovidiu, Olar and Konrad Petrovszky worked with other researchers to consider the history of the European portions of the Ottoman Empire between the 15th and 18th centuries through exactly that lens. The Ottoman Empire was the state centered on what's modern-day Turkey, which expanded to reach much of the Mediterranean, parts of North Africa, Mesopotamia, and of course, parts of Europe.
We're talking about Ottoman Europe, which is a flexible term, because as with any big empire, pre-modern empire, these empires grew but also shrank, and so the space we're talking about basically covers what we tend to call the Balkans today, which is southeastern Europe, south of the Danube River, but also including larger swathes of today's Romania, outside the Carpathian Mountains, because they were part of this complex polity called the Ottoman Empire at the time. If we speak of nation states, follower states of the Ottoman Empire, we have to include, if I'm correct, like 14 countries, including Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova.
Mainly to split ways with the way the history of the region for the early modern times was done and was written, which is through either a nationalistic lens, Romanians doing their history from their point of view, Bulgarians the same, the Greeks the same, and so on and so forth. So we tried to see that this area that we are at the period, at the times we are talking about, was pre-nation state area that was an imperial realm on the other hand, and on one hand, and on the other hand we wanted to make justice to the Ottomans also, because the history of the area, whether we talk about the Balkans, Southeast European history, was sometimes addressed in terms of post-Byzantium, post-Byzantine, or post-something. And as it happens with the history of post-states, lots of details are lost in the process. And one of the ways, when you speak about post-Byzantine studies, for example, for the entire period after the fall of Constantinople in 4053 to roughly 8021, you basically extract the Ottomans out of the question, which is like an important part of the history of the Balkans, who are basically not taken into account.
The term Ottoman Europe isn't to everyone's liking. This is because of how the presence of the Ottoman rule is portrayed in the national historiographies of this region. Oftentimes, the period between the medieval period and the beginning of the 19th century is viewed as being buried under the so-called Ottoman yoke. A continuity of what later became a nation like Romania started in the medieval period, a golden age, a cradle, which is then obscured by the imposed rule only to emerge again once they were gone.
What's called traditionally medieval period for many of the states in the region coincides with the period of glory, an imperial period. You have the Byzantine Empire. They never called themselves Byzantine, of course. They were the Roman Empire of the East, but they were an empire. Then you'd have the Bulgarians, still an empire. Have the Serbians, an empire. Once the conquest of the Balkans, of southeastern Europe starts, and the Ottomans become more and more present, this golden period started to kind of become problematic from the point of view of a nationalistic historiography. So later on, how would you explain that? And it was explained indeed in terms of yoke, everything like what's dark centuries. Therefore, the Ottomans and the Ottoman state, the Ottoman presence, the Ottoman agents were transformed into sort of a nebula. We don't know who they are, but they are. They come, they conquer, and they're there. And basically for the next centuries, they oppress, and nothing basically of importance happens, except for some movements of either survival, national conservation of some ideas, resistance to the said yoke, which is, of course, not entirely what happened.
Exactly this idea of the past golden age is what inspired them to look at what's actually going on in the field. What do the sources say about the continuities that exist or the pitfalls that these continuities present?
When you say have a look into standard literature, like surveys of this period, or like more popular works dedicated to the Ottoman period, as I said, sometimes still called the late Middle Ages, sort of, you'll often find complaints about the lack of sources, which sort of corresponds to the idea of a decline, that particularly the Christian communities of the Balkans were forced to silence, were silenced by this rule, which, as a matter of fact, is not true. There are plenty of sources, but we don't have to limit ourselves just to one particular language, but to take into consideration the very fact that this is a multilingual, multiscriptural region, and that even not on the level of the empire as a whole, but in specific areas, texts were written in a variety of languages. And this brings us to the problem of discipline, of scientific discipline, that is also at stake here, because the field has been largely compartmentalized, like fractured between various disciplines, not only organized on a national level of national interest, but also in terms of approach, of method. Ottomans have been looking largely for Ottoman Turkish sources. Greek historians have been looking for Greek written sources, and so on and so forth. But if you take a more integrative approach, you'll find out that the lack of source is not the problem per se, but the question is how to master the variety of languages and, of course, the different types of sources that we have for this period. And this holds true also for the narrative sources. And historiography is a narrative endeavor in the first place, of making sense of your past, but also of your present.
The idea is to not just mine a text for plain information, but to make sense of the purpose. How were they trying to interpret the world their authors were living in? How did an author of that period differ from an author nowadays? Is history written today as it was then? Did it mean the same thing? As an example, it would be unthinkable today to write a historical text in poetic verses. You would not be taken seriously by the historical field, but in the 17th century, that wasn't a problem. You've realized by now that the area of Ottoman Europe is highly complex, not just politically, but linguistically also. Prestige languages like Ottoman Turkish, Greek, Church Slavonic, but also the local languages like Romanian, we can call this a so-called communication space, which is important in the context of studying comparative historiography. Ottoman Europe could be loosely defined by the sheer presence of the Ottomans in the first place. and what that means for the economic exchange, forms of rule, administrative practices, but also in terms of cultural exchange, manuscript circulation, and the exchange of goods and ideas in general.
It also does not mean that communication is to be considered as a peaceful, it can only be considered as a peaceful exchange. It also means conflict, rivalry, competition, lack of communication even, because also conflict is in a way a type of communicating. So it's an attempt to create a concept that encompasses the varieties of exchange, the levels of exchange, and the clusters of exchange.
This perspective to include the conflict and lack of communication is important, especially when we try to understand how our modern view of a concept like Europe was shaped and how we continue to reproduce it. The self-understanding of Europe that was developed in the early modern period often comes from separating oneself from the so-called Turkish threat. At the same time, historiographic literature produced within the Ottoman Empire was treated as if it didn't come from within the communication space of Ottoman Europe or from people who were by default hostile against it. This, of course, produced a bias that has huge repercussions in today's debates. To push against this, we have to consider the actual milieu in which these texts were produced.
Because there are two basic assumptions that are to be found in literature on the Ottoman period in Southeastern Europe. The one is that communities, Christian communities, Muslim communities, were self-contained, and that cultural debates were largely, or had to be studied within these contained spaces. And the other is that the Ottoman Empire, and this holds true specifically for the Christian communities, was basically just a canvas, just a context, an external experience to which a passing note is enough to understand its importance. And our claim is no, we have to start from it. We have to take this whole constellation as the starting point of discussion, and this means working together.
We are living in times where the narratives, the historical narratives, are very important. They are used left and right for different purposes. Sometimes most of the times, nothing to do with, say, science necessarily. Therefore, any attempt of bringing more critical approach to the topic, I think, is more than welcomed. More than welcome, especially given this fantastic fight to produce the right narrative and then control it, impose it and control it. So I think all critical looks at the material we work on, and it's also like useful for the people who engage with it. It's part of the training. It's a training to kind of to become less prone to just take for granted specific narrative or another. We need to check and double check and kind of question it.
Thanks for watching. I'm curious, have you ever been in a situation where you noticed your own bias or managed to correct someone else's? Was I able to give you a new perspective today? I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments, and until next time.